For years, the small suburban town had prided itself on its sense of order, uniformity, and manicured perfection. It was a place where the grass never grew taller than 2 inches. Mailboxes had to be painted an identical shade of off-white, and the homeowners association ruled with a clipboard in one hand and a fine book in the other. To most outsiders, it was simply another development built on the promise of peace and stability. But beneath the calm veneer, the gears of control churned, waiting for an opportunity to tighten their grip. Long before the town had spread out in neat cookie-cutter rows of homes, there had been a stretch of land on the western edge. It wasn't much to look at. Overgrown, dotted with pine trees, bordered by a broken-down fence. The locals passed by it daily without much thought, dismissing it as unused woodland, maybe even abandoned. Yet the land had a quiet story, one that had been forgotten by almost everyone except the man who owned it. The man was named Henry Carter. His family had held that land for generations, dating back long before the development craze swept through the county. For Henry, the land wasn't just property. It was heritage, memory, and promise. His grandfather had worked it by hand, his father had refused offers from early developers, and Henry himself had grown up playing beneath its trees. Even as housing developments consumed the countryside, Henry never let go of the deed tucked neatly in his fireproof safe. Developers hated landowners like Henry. To them, property was opportunity, and undeveloped acreage was wasted potential. They had approached Henry several times in the past, flashing numbers that seemed staggering to ordinary people. But Henry always declined with a polite firmness. He wasn't interested in selling, not for any price. The land was his, and as far as he was concerned, it would always be his. This refusal made him an obstacle. And in the world of real estate development, obstacles weren't tolerated for long. It started with whispers, rumors that the land wasn't legally clear, that old survey maps showed conflicting boundaries. When Henry ignored them, the whispers grew louder, spreading through town meetings and development boards. Eventually, the HOA of the largest nearby subdivision got involved. On paper, they claimed the land was unaccounted for. They argued it was technically part of a community expansion zone, a vague designation that existed only in their bylaws but carried just enough weight to stir confusion. Henry wasn't worried at first. He knew his title was clean, his deed airtight. But what he didn't anticipate was the sheer audacity of the HOA. Without notifying him directly, they began quietly incorporating his acres into their development plans. Construction markers appeared at the edges of his property. Survey crews came and went, hammering stakes into the earth as if it were theirs. Within months, construction equipment rolled in, tearing through brush, leveling ground, and pouring foundations. Henry stood on his porch one morning, coffee in hand, as bulldozers chewed through the tree line. What had once been his quiet sanctuary now echoed with the sounds of engines, shouts, and clattering machinery. They weren't just encroaching, they were taking. By the time he demanded answers, it was already too late. Roads had been laid, utilities installed, and rows upon rows of identical homes were rising across the acreage his family had guarded for decades. In the eyes of the HOA, this wasn't theft, it was progress. They insisted that his land had been reclassified and absorbed into the subdivision expansion. To them, he was just a stubborn old landowner who hadn't kept up with the paperwork. But Henry knew better. He hadn't just watched them steal his land. He had watched them walk into the trap he'd quietly set years ago. Because Henry wasn't just a landowner, he was also a strategist, a man who had seen enough of the world to know that power needed to be protected with precision. Decades earlier, when developers first came knocking, Henry had hired the best real estate attorney he could find. Together, they had built legal protections into the deed, clauses, covenants, and contingencies that seemed overly cautious at the time. They ensured that no transfer, no seizure, no reclassification could occur without his explicit, notarized consent. To the casual eye, the deed looked ordinary. But buried within its fine print was a fortress of legal safeguards. The HOA hadn't just stolen his land. They had built 120 homes directly on a foundation of legal quicksand. As Henry quietly gathered his papers, copies of deeds and documentation, he couldn't help but marvel at the irony. The same HOA that fined residents for slightly faded blinds, that mailed warning letters over trash cans left out too long, that prided itself on enforcing rules down to the inch, had broken the most fundamental rule of all. They had built an empire on something that wasn't theirs, and Henry was about to make them pay. Because while the HOA thought they had erased him from the picture, they had overlooked one small detail. Henry Carter still held the title. And soon, the entire community would learn what that really meant. The development sparkled at first glance, a pristine row of identical homes standing shoulder to shoulder, their siding still bright, their driveways smooth and unblemished. To the families who moved in, the neighborhood felt like the promise of stability, safe streets, uniform lawns, a fresh start. They unpacked boxes, hung curtains, and took photos in front of their new homes, never suspecting that beneath their freshly laid foundations was a storm waiting to erupt. The HOA, flush with self-satisfaction, began collecting dues immediately. They enforced every petty rule with relentless precision. Trash bins had to be rolled to the curb no earlier than 6 a.m. and no later than 6:30. Grass taller than 3 inches was fined. Even wreaths on doors were regulated by season. Residents grumbled quietly, but they complied, believing that these rules preserved property value. But then came the first letter. It arrived at the HOA office, neatly typed, addressed to the board of directors. At first glance, it looked like any other correspondence until they read the sender's name. Henry Carter. The letter was short, but sharp. It outlined in precise language that every square foot of the land beneath their 120 homes legally belonged to him. He included copies of his deed, highlighted the protective covenants embedded within it, and noted that at no point had he sold, transferred, or relinquished ownership. His land had been taken without consent, and now he was demanding resolution. The board laughed it off initially. To them, it was just the ramblings of a stubborn man clinging to an outdated claim. They brushed it aside, confident that the county permits, the developer's paperwork, and their HOA bylaws would shield them. But then the second letter came. This one thicker, with a lawyer's letterhead. It wasn't a complaint this time. It was a notice of pending legal action. The laughter stopped. Suddenly the board found themselves scrambling through records, digging through permits and contracts. They expected to find airtight documentation that secured their control. Instead, they uncovered troubling gaps. Survey maps contradicted one another. County files showed the land in Henry's name. The supposed reclassification that justified the expansion turned out to be a procedural sleight of hand, pushed through with vague language and rubber stamp approvals. None of it overrode the deed protections Henry had in place. The HOA panicked. If Henry's claims held, it meant something unthinkable. The homes weren't legally sitting on HOA property. They were sitting on his. Meanwhile, word began to spread. At first it was whispered between board members, then trickled into the community itself. Some residents dismissed it as nonsense, the kind of rumor that circulates whenever people dislike authority. But others grew uneasy. They had invested everything into these homes. Mortgages, savings, futures, all tied up in houses they might not legally own. Henry, for his part, remained calm. He didn't storm into meetings or shout at officials. He simply let the process unfold, confident in the trap he had set years earlier. While the HOA scrambled to cover their mistake, Henry and his lawyer quietly prepared filings that would assert his ownership rights in court. The tension reached a breaking point when the county clerk, pressed by multiple inquiries, confirmed the truth. The land deed remained in Henry Carter's name. The developments, the roads, the utilities, every improvement had been built on property that wasn't theirs to build on. The HOA tried desperately to find an escape. They attempted to negotiate directly with Henry, offering lump sums of cash to make the problem go away. But Henry wasn't interested. This wasn't just about money. It was about principle, legacy, and justice. Worse yet, Henry's lawyer had pointed out a brutal reality. Because the HOA had knowingly, or at the very least recklessly, built on private land without clear title, they had exposed themselves to massive liability. Not only could Henry claim ownership of the land, but he also had a strong case for claiming ownership of every structure built on it. By law, improvements made on another's land often belonged to the landowner, not the builder. That meant the 120 homes, the roads, even the community pool, the entire subdivision, might legally be his. As this realization sank in, cracks began to form in the HOA's authority. Homeowners started questioning the board's competence. Emergency meetings were called, but they only fueled anger. Residents demanded answers the board couldn't provide. They wanted reassurance that their homes were safe, that their investments weren't about to evaporate. Instead, they were met with stammering evasions, promises that it will be resolved soon, and desperate pleas for patience. Patience wore thin. Some residents began contacting Henry directly, hoping for clarity. Henry didn't lash out or gloat. He simply told them the truth, that they had been misled, that their board had gambled with land it didn't own. He wasn't out to ruin families, but he wasn't about to let the HOA walk away unscathed either. The local news caught wind of the story next. Headlines blared about the subdivision built on stolen land. Reporters swarmed the neighborhood, cameras capturing images of worried families standing in front of homes they weren't sure they truly owned. The HOA, once a symbol of control, was now a spectacle of incompetence and arrogance. Pressure mounted. Residents demanded the resignation of the board. Lawsuits flew in every direction. Some homeowners sued the HOA for negligence, others sued the developer. The developer, in turn, tried to deflect blame onto the county for approving permits. But at the center of it all stood Henry, calm and unwavering, holding the deed that had become the linchpin of the entire conflict. And as the first court date drew near, the HOA began to realize just how dire their situation was. They hadn't just stolen a man's land. They had built a fragile empire on it, and Henry was about to take it all back. The courthouse sat at the heart of the county, a building of brick and stone that had watched over countless disputes, most small, some historic. But on the morning Henry Carter's case appeared on the docket, it buzzed with an unusual energy. Reporters lined the steps, cameras ready to capture what many already called the subdivision showdown. Inside, residents filled the gallery, desperate to hear whether their homes were truly theirs, or whether they had become unwilling tenants on another man's land. Henry arrived quietly, dressed simply, carrying only a folder of documents. He didn't need theatrics. He had facts. The HOA, however, showed up in force. Their board members marched in with lawyers at their sides, stacks of binders and frantic whispers betraying their nerves. They were used to intimidating homeowners with threats of fines and liens. But in court, the power shifted. Here they weren't the enforcers, they were the defendants. The judge opened proceedings with measured calm. The case was straightforward in framing but monumental in implication. Did the land beneath the subdivision belong to Henry Carter, as his deed claimed, or to the HOA, as their expansion plans insisted? The answer would decide the fate of 120 homes and the families who lived in them. Henry's lawyer spoke first, laying out the story with meticulous clarity. He presented the original deed, recorded decades earlier, complete with protective covenants that explicitly prohibited any transfer without Henry's notarized consent. He showed how, despite multiple attempts, Henry had never sold the land, never leased it, never relinquished control. Then came the county records, documents confirming that even as construction proceeded, the land title remained under Henry's name. The lawyer's voice was steady, but the weight of his words pressed into the room. Every home, every road, every improvement had been built unlawfully on Henry's property. By the letter of the law, ownership of the structures defaulted to the landowner, Henry himself. When it was the HOA's turn, their arguments crumbled under scrutiny. Their attorneys pointed to permits and zoning approvals, insisting that the county had effectively reclassified the land. But under questioning, those permits proved riddled with vague language and bureaucratic shortcuts. None of them overrode the deed. When pressed to provide a single document transferring ownership from Henry, they had nothing. The HOA board members shifted in their seats, beads of sweat glistening under the courtroom lights. The homeowners in the gallery murmured, anger swelling as they realized how recklessly their leaders had gambled with their futures. But the most devastating moment came when Henry's lawyer unveiled the trap Henry had set decades before. With almost theatrical timing, he presented a clause buried in the deed, a clause stating that any unauthorized construction or use of the land would not only revert ownership of improvements to Henry, but also subject violators to penalties calculated at current market value. It was a bombshell. Not only did Henry legally own the homes, but the HOA and developer now faced potential damages in the millions. The judge's eyebrows lifted as he read the clause, and silence rippled across the courtroom. Even the reporters stopped scribbling for a moment, stunned. This wasn't just a property dispute anymore. It was a catastrophe for the HOA. The trial stretched on for days, each session peeling back more layers of negligence and arrogance. The developer, dragged into the case, argued that they had acted in good faith, relying on county approvals. The county tried to distance itself, claiming clerical errors, but none of it shifted the central fact. Henry had never surrendered his land. As witnesses testified, more ugly details emerged. Emails between HOA board members revealed they had been warned of title issues during planning, but chose to ignore them, assuming Henry would eventually cave or be too powerless to fight. Those emails, projected on courtroom screens, painted a damning picture of deliberate disregard. By the end of the third week, the outcome was clear. The judge ruled firmly in Henry's favor. The land, and by extension the 120 homes, legally belonged to him. The HOA had overstepped, the developer had built recklessly, and the county had failed in oversight. But none of that stripped Henry of his rights as the landowner. The gallery erupted with gasps, shouts, and tears. Homeowners looked around in disbelief, some furious, others terrified. They had sunk their life savings into houses they technically no longer owned. The HOA board members sat pale and silent, their empire of fines and authority collapsing before their eyes. Henry, however, remained composed. He hadn't come to gloat. He had come for justice, and now he had it. Still, the judge wasn't finished. He ordered a separate hearing to determine remedies and damages, a process that could take months and reshape the entire subdivision's future. Would the families be allowed to stay? Would they owe rent to Henry? Would the HOA be dismantled entirely? The answers weren't yet clear, but one thing was certain. The HOA had fallen straight into Henry's legal trap, and there was no easy way out. As the court adjourned that day, residents spilled into the parking lot, their conversations filled with fear and speculation. The media swarmed Henry, but he declined interviews, disappearing quietly into his car. The HOA board, meanwhile, was met with angry confrontations from their own neighbors, demanding resignations and accountability. The storm had only just begun. Because now that Henry had secured victory in court, the question became not whether he owned the land, but what he intended to do with it. The ruling hit the subdivision like a thunderclap. Overnight, the illusion of security that the HOA had spent years enforcing was shattered. Homeowners who once fretted about the color of their blinds or the length of their grass now faced a far more terrifying reality. The ground beneath their feet was no longer theirs. For many, the shock gave way to rage. They had trusted the HOA, believed in its promises of stability, and now discovered those promises were built on theft. Meetings erupted in chaos with residents shouting down board members who stammered excuses. Some demanded resignations, others wanted criminal charges. A few, in hushed voices, wondered if they should pack up and leave before things grew worse. The HOA board crumbled quickly under the weight of outrage. The president resigned within days, followed by the treasurer and secretary. The remaining members went silent, retreating into the shadows as lawsuits mounted. Formerly feared as petty tyrants, they were now pariahs in their own neighborhood. Cars slowed outside their homes, neighbors muttered insults, and once friendly waves turned into cold stares. But while the board collapsed, the true burden fell on the residents themselves. Mortgage companies began to question the validity of their loans. After all, the houses securing those loans were technically no longer owned by the borrowers. Title insurers balked, pointing to exclusions that left homeowners exposed. Some banks threatened foreclosure, others froze refinancing. What had been a neighborhood of dream homes was rapidly turning into a financial nightmare. The media coverage amplified the chaos. News stations ran nightly segments, interviews with distraught families who had poured savings into houses now claimed by another man. National outlets picked up the story, painting the HOA as a cautionary tale of arrogance and overreach. Social media erupted with hashtags mocking the downfall of the once proud association. And at the center of it all was Henry Carter. He had won the legal battle, but now he faced the moral one. He held the deed, the land, and, by extension, ownership of 120 homes. Legally, he could demand rent. He could sell the land out from under the residents. He could even evict them entirely. Every option was his to choose, and the entire community waited nervously to see what kind of man he truly was. Henry, however, took his time. He didn't rush to seize property or collect payments. Instead, he met quietly with his lawyer, considering the options carefully. This wasn't about revenge, though part of him relished the justice of it. It was about legacy. The land had belonged to his family for generations, and now, after decades of pressure to sell, he held all the cards. The question was how to play them. In the meantime, chaos only deepened. With the HOA effectively defunct, rules went unenforced. Some residents, bitter and rebellious, let their lawns grow wild, painted their houses in garish colors, or parked broken cars in their driveways as acts of defiance. Others, desperate to cling to normalcy, tried to maintain order themselves, forming informal committees to keep up appearances. The once uniform streets fractured into a patchwork of rebellion and resignation. Lawyers swarmed the neighborhood, each family hiring representation to protect their interests. Some pursued claims against the developer for fraud, others against the county for negligence. Court dockets filled with lawsuits, each one tangled in the larger mess Henry's victory had revealed. The developer, once celebrated for bringing modern living to the area, faced ruin. Their stock plummeted, investors fled, and executives scrambled to deny responsibility. The county commissioners, too, found themselves under fire, accused of rubber-stamping approvals without due diligence. What had begun as a property dispute now threatened careers, reputations, and fortunes far beyond the neighborhood's borders. Through it all, Henry remained a quiet but unyielding figure. Neighbors approached him cautiously, some begging for leniency, others accusing him of heartlessness. But Henry didn't lash out. He listened, nodded, and walked away without making promises. The uncertainty gnawed at everyone. Was he preparing to take their homes, or was he planning something else entirely? The answer came 1 month later, at a town hall meeting held in the community center. The room was packed, air thick with tension. Reporters lined the walls, cameras trained on the podium where Henry finally stepped forward. He spoke calmly, his voice steady, but resolute. He reminded the crowd that the land had belonged to his family for generations, that he had never agreed to sell, and that the HOA had stolen what was not theirs to take. He explained that the court had affirmed his rights, but that he wasn't blind to the reality facing the families caught in the middle. Then he laid out his decision. Henry would not evict the residents. He would not demand back rent or seize their homes outright. Instead, he would dissolve the HOA entirely and replace it with a community land trust under his stewardship. Each family would be offered a choice: continue living on the land by leasing the ground beneath their home at a fair fixed rate, or buy their lot directly from him at a price based on its original pre-development value, not the inflated market rate. Gasps rippled through the room. It was a stunning move, merciful to residents, devastating to the HOA, and brilliant in its balance. Families would have a path to true ownership, free from the HOA's suffocating control. Those who couldn't afford to buy could still stay, secure under lease agreements that protected them from predatory increases. Reporters scrambled to capture every word. Residents whispered to one another, some sighing in relief, others still wary. But the shift was undeniable. Henry had turned what could have been a nightmare of mass evictions into a chance for families to reclaim stability. For the HOA, however, it was the final nail in the coffin. Stripped of authority, bankrupt from legal fees, and disgraced in the eyes of the public, it ceased to exist overnight. The petty rulers who once fined neighbors for leaving trash cans out now faced their own reckoning, some under investigation for fraud, others hounded by lawsuits. The neighborhood itself began to change. Without the HOA's rigid grip, individuality blossomed. Lawns no longer looked identical, but they reflected the people who lived there. Decorations appeared year-round, gardens grew wild, and laughter replaced the constant tension of enforcement. It wasn't uniform anymore, but it was alive. Henry had won, but more importantly, he had reshaped the community on his own terms. Yet even as relief spread, a lingering question remained. Had this truly settled the matter, or was there still another twist to come? The subdivision settled into an uneasy calm in the months following Henry's announcement. What had once been a neighborhood defined by uniformity and control was now something far more complex, a patchwork of relief, resentment, and renewal. Families who had feared losing everything breathed easier, but the scars of betrayal ran deep. Trust in institutions, the HOA, the developer, even the county, had been shattered. At first, residents hesitated to believe Henry's offer. Many assumed there would be hidden catches, buried clauses, or sudden rent hikes. They had lived too long under the rule of the HOA to imagine leadership without exploitation. But slowly, as contracts were signed and leases formalized, confidence began to grow. Henry's terms remained fair, exactly as he had promised. The community land trust was real, not a trick, and it gave families security that the HOA never could. Some jumped at the chance to buy their lots outright, locking in ownership of both home and land for the first time. Others chose to lease, grateful for a predictable and manageable arrangement. Over time, the dread that once clung to every conversation faded, replaced by a cautious optimism. But while the residents moved forward, the downfall of the HOA echoed loudly beyond the neighborhood. The county launched investigations into how the subdivision had been approved without proper land transfers. Emails and meeting notes surfaced, showing a pattern of willful ignorance and political pressure to fast-track development. Several officials quietly resigned before indictments could land. Developers across the region scrambled to review their projects, terrified of similar traps waiting to be sprung. The former HOA board members faced their own reckoning. Lawsuits piled high, some from residents demanding restitution, others from the developer seeking damages for reputational ruin. Bankruptcy became inevitable. Those who once boasted about their authority now lived under constant legal and financial siege. The developer fared little better. Their brand became synonymous with recklessness, their projects boycotted by wary buyers. Investors fled. Within a year, the company collapsed, its assets liquidated to cover mounting claims. And through it all, Henry Carter's name spread far and wide. To some, he became a local legend, the man who had stood firm against powerful forces and turned the tables. To others, he was a symbol of patient resistance, a reminder that heritage and foresight could outlast greed. His story circulated online, shared in viral videos and podcasts under titles like The HOA That Built on the Wrong Land and The Black Man Who Outsmarted an Entire Subdivision. Comment sections overflowed with praise, laughter at the HOA's downfall, and admiration for Henry's restraint. But for Henry himself, the fame meant little. He remained the same quiet man who had started with nothing more than a deed and a determination to protect it. He still walked the land, now dotted with homes, but he carried himself with the same calm dignity as before. His satisfaction wasn't in headlines or praise. It was in knowing that his family's legacy had not only survived, but reshaped an entire community. The subdivision, once suffocating under HOA control, found new life. Without endless fines and uniformity, individuality flourished. Children's bikes cluttered yards without fear of citations. Families painted their houses in colors they loved, not what a rule book dictated. Neighbors gathered not in sterile board meetings but in backyard cookouts and block parties. The land Henry had fought to protect now held a community more vibrant than ever. And yet, his victory carried a deeper lesson, one that rippled far beyond his neighborhood. It was a reminder that power unchecked breeds arrogance, that rules meant to preserve often become tools of control, and that sometimes the quietest voices carry the strongest defenses. Henry had not shouted, bullied, or schemed. He had simply prepared, waited, and let the HOA walk headfirst into the trap they thought didn't exist. In the end, the story wasn't just about land. It was about justice. About standing firm when others dismissed you. About the strength to outlast institutions that believed they were untouchable. Henry Carter had watched as bulldozers tore through his trees and his memories. He had seen strangers build lives on what was his. But he had never wavered. And when the time came, he didn't just reclaim what belonged to him. He turned it into something greater. Years later, new families moved into the subdivision. They heard the story in pieces, neighbors retelling it over fences, kids whispering about the man who owned the whole neighborhood. The HOA was long gone, but its downfall lived on as legend. Visitors pointed to the streets and said, "That's where they built on the wrong land." And somewhere Henry Carter smiled, knowing that his family's land had never been stolen after all. It had simply waited, for him, for his trap, and for justice.